Imagine opening a letter that doesn't just ruin your week. It ruins your year. That's what happened the morning I unfolded a notice from my HOA demanding $100,000, all because of a dock on my own lakefront property. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I remember that detail with crystal clarity, because Tuesdays had always been my favorite day of the week. Quiet, productive, full of possibility. The mailman's truck had rumbled down Lakeshore Drive just after 10 a.m., leaving behind the usual collection of bills and advertisements. But this envelope was different, heavier, more deliberate. The paper stock felt expensive between my fingers, almost luxurious in its weight. The return address read Sunset Lakes Homeowners Association in embossed letters that seemed to mock me with their formality. My heart began its familiar gallop whenever HOA correspondence arrived. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what lay inside. The chemical smell of fresh ink hit my nostrils as I unfolded the tri-folded document. Legal letterhead. Official stamps. The kind of bureaucratic theater designed to intimidate before you even read the first word. My eyes scanned the opening paragraph once, twice, 3 times before my brain could process what I was seeing. Notice of violation and penalty assessment. $100,000. The numbers blurred. My coffee mug suddenly felt impossibly heavy in my other hand. The morning sun streaming through my kitchen window seemed to dim, as if the very light was retreating from the absurdity of what I was reading. $100,000. For a dock on my own property. A dock I had built with proper permits, following every county regulation, spending my own money on materials that met or exceeded every safety standard. A dock that extended from my shoreline, land that I owned, that I paid taxes on, that bore my name on the deed. The letter continued with bureaucratic precision. Unauthorized structure violating HOA Architectural Review Committee guidelines. Failure to obtain proper HOA approval. Disruption to community aesthetic standards. The words became a blur of legal jargon designed to justify the unjustifiable. My hands trembled as I read further. They weren't just demanding money, they were threatening my home. Failure to pay assessed penalties within 30 days will result in the initiation of foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. The word hit like a physical blow. They wanted to take my house because I built a dock on my own land. I sank into my kitchen chair, the one my grandfather had built from reclaimed barnwood, and stared out at the lake through my window. There it was, my dock, 30 feet of pressure-treated lumber extending into the crystal-clear water of Lake Harmony. The morning sun danced across its weathered planks, the same planks where my daughter had learned to fish, where my wife and I shared coffee at sunrise, where neighbors had gathered for impromptu conversations that stretched into the evening hours. The dock wasn't an eyesore or a safety hazard. It was barely visible from the street. It didn't block anyone's view or interfere with anyone's property. It was simply a modest wooden structure that allowed my family to enjoy the waterfront we had worked so hard to afford. And now, somehow, it had become the instrument of my potential destruction. The HOA president's signature sprawled across the bottom of the letter. Margaret Thornfield, a woman whose smile had never reached her eyes in all our neighborhood encounters. Beside her signature was a printed addendum. The Sunset Lakes HOA is committed to maintaining property values and community standards for all residents. The irony was suffocating. They were threatening to destroy my family's financial stability in the name of protecting property values. I called my wife Sarah at work, my voice barely steady enough to explain what had arrived in our mailbox. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. $100,000? She finally whispered. For our dock? They're calling it an unauthorized structure. But we have permits. We followed every rule. Not their rules, apparently. The conversation that followed blurred together. frantic discussions about lawyers we couldn't afford, mortgage payments we might miss, the college fund we'd been building for our daughter Emma that might have to be sacrificed to pay this astronomical fine. The American dream we'd worked 20 years to achieve was crumbling because of 30 feet of wood and metal extending into a lake we'd bought specifically to enjoy. That evening, I walked out to the dock as the sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. The boards creaked familiarly under my feet, a sound that had always brought comfort, but now felt ominous. I sat on the edge, my feet dangling in the water, and tried to process the surreal reality that this peaceful place had somehow become ground zero for a battle I never wanted to fight. The letter sat on my kitchen table like a ticking bomb. $100,000, 30 days, foreclosure proceedings. The words cycled through my mind in an endless, anxiety-inducing loop. Sarah found me there an hour later, staring at the water as darkness fell around the lake. "What are we going to do?" she asked, settling beside me on the dock. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But something was crystallizing in my chest. Not panic, not despair, but something harder and more determined. The HOA thought this letter would break me, thought the sheer audacity of their demand would force me into immediate compliance. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had learned to fight for what mattered. "They think this letter is going to destroy us," I said quietly, watching the last light fade from the sky. "They have no idea it's going to become the spark that destroys them." Sarah squeezed my hand. In the distance, lights began twinkling on in houses around the lake. Neighbors who had no idea that a war had just been declared in paradise. Some of them would choose sides before this was over. Others would remain silent, hoping to avoid becoming targets themselves. But Margaret Thornfield and her HOA board had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed I would roll over, pay their extortionate fine, and remove my dock in shame. They thought they were dealing with just another homeowner who could be bullied into submission with official letterhead and legal threats. What they didn't know was that I had spent 15 years as an insurance investigator, trained to dig through documents and find the details others missed. They didn't know that my quiet demeanor masked a stubborn streak that my family had learned to both admire and fear. And they certainly didn't know that buried somewhere in their own HOA bylaws was a clause that would turn their weapon against me into the instrument of their own destruction. The dock creaked gently in the evening breeze, and for the first time since opening that letter, I smiled. 5 years earlier, Sarah and I had driven down Lakeshore Drive for the first time, with Emma bouncing excitedly in the back seat, her face pressed against the window as Lake Harmony came into view. The realtor's description hadn't done justice to the pristine water stretching like a mirror between rolling hills, dotted with cattails and the occasional great blue heron standing statue still in the shallows. "This is it," Sarah had breathed, and I knew she was right before. We'd even stepped out of the car. The house wasn't the largest on the lake, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with cedar siding that had weathered to a soft silver gray. But it was ours. More importantly, it came with 150 feet of pristine lakefront, complete with mature oak trees that would provide perfect shade for summer afternoons and a gentle slope that led right to the water's edge. Moving day had felt like a celebration. Neighbors emerged from their houses to wave and offer assistance as the moving truck navigated the narrow street. Mrs. Patterson from across the street brought fresh-baked cookies still warm from the oven. The Hendersons next door helped carry our heaviest furniture and invited us to a barbecue that weekend. Even Margaret Thornfield, the HOA president, had stopped by with a welcome basket filled with local honey and a guidebook about Lake Harmony's history. "Welcome to paradise," she'd said, with what seemed like genuine warmth. "We're so glad to have a young family join our community." Those first months felt like stepping into a Norman Rockwell painting. Emma learned to swim in the gentle waters just off our shoreline. her delighted shrieks echoing across the lake on summer evenings. Sarah and I would sit on our small patio with morning coffee, watching the mist rise from the water as the sun painted the sky in watercolor pastels. Loons called to each other from hidden coves, their haunting voices the perfect soundtrack to our newfound peace. The community embraced us completely. There were annual block parties where the street transformed into a festival of grilled corn and children's laughter. Winter brought ice fishing tournaments and spontaneous hockey games on the frozen lake. Spring meant community garden days where neighbors shared plants and advice in equal measure. But even in those early honeymoon months, there were subtle signs that not everyone shared the same vision of community harmony. The first letter from the HOA arrived just 6 weeks after we'd moved in. A polite but firm reminder that our mailbox needed to be regulation black, rather than the deep blue we'd chosen to match our shutters. A week later, another letter informed us that our grass was a 1/4 inch longer than the maximum allowable height of 2 3/4 inches. "They're just trying to maintain standards," Sarah had said, though I caught the edge of irritation in her voice as she painted our mailbox black. "Every neighborhood has rules," the letters kept coming. Our garden fence was 6 inches too tall. Our Christmas lights stayed up 2 days past the January 2nd removal deadline. Our car was parked suboptimally in our own driveway. Each violation came with increasingly formal language and mounting penalty fees that started at $25, but quickly escalated. Other neighbors began sharing similar stories in hushed conversations by the mailboxes. The Hendersons had been fined for their bird feeder attracting non-regulation. Wildlife. Mrs. Patterson received a violation for her. Prize-winning roses extending 3 inches beyond the approved planting boundary. The young couple at the end of the street was threatened with legal action because their toddler's chalk art on their own driveway was deemed unsightly temporary decoration. "It wasn't always like this," confided Tom Henderson one evening, as we watched our kids play in the lake. "When we moved here 10 years ago, the HOA basically just organized the annual picnic and made sure everyone's dues got paid. But ever since Margaret took over as president, it's been like living under a microscope." Still, the beauty of Lake Harmony made the harassment feel manageable. There was something healing about the rhythm of water against the shoreline, something that put the HOA's petty tyranny into perspective. Emma was thriving, making friends with children from around the lake. Sarah had started a neighborhood book club that met monthly on different porches. I was sleeping better than I had in years, lulled by the gentle sounds of water and wind. It was during our second summer that I began seriously considering building a dock. Emma was becoming a confident swimmer, but launching our small fishing boat from the shoreline was awkward and sometimes unsafe. Other houses around the lake had modest docks, simple wooden structures that served as launching points for boats and gathering places for families. I researched county regulations meticulously. Lake Harmony had specific guidelines about dock construction. Maximum length 30 feet, minimum distance from property lines, environmental impact considerations, permit requirements. Every box could be checked. Every regulation could be met. The county inspector who came to review our plans was encouraging and thorough. "Beautiful location for a dock," he said, standing on our shoreline and gesturing toward the deep water just off our property. "You've got perfect depth here, good access, minimal environmental impact. Should be a straightforward approval." The permit process took 3 months, but eventually the official approval arrived. A document I would later cling to like a lifeline. Permit approved for construction of 30-foot residential dock, Sunset Lakes Development, Lot 47. I framed it and hung it in my workshop, proud of having navigated the bureaucratic process successfully. Construction began on a crisp September morning. I'd hired Mike Rodriguez, a local contractor recommended by 3 different neighbors, and his crew worked with efficient precision. The sound of hammering and the smell of fresh lumber became the soundtrack of our days. Emma would hurry home from school to check the progress, measuring the dock's extension into the lake with her own small ruler. "Daddy, it's going to be the most beautiful dock on the whole lake," she declared as the final planks were secured. She wasn't wrong. The dock was simple but elegant, pressure-treated lumber with a natural finish that would weather to a soft gray over time. Safety railings met all specifications. The floating section at the end moved gently with the lake's rhythm. It was everything I had envisioned, a place for our family to fish, swim, and simply enjoy the water we'd worked so hard to call our own. The first evening after completion, our family walked to the end of the dock together. Emma immediately declared it the perfect spot for reading, while Sarah pointed out how the sunset looked different from this new vantage point, somehow more spectacular framed by the gentle ripples of the lake. Neighbors began stopping by to admire the craftsmanship. The Hendersons asked about Mike Rodriguez's contact information, hoping to build their own dock the following year. Mrs. Patterson brought Emma a fishing rod and taught her to tie proper knots. Even some of the more distant neighbors made a point of complimenting the dock during evening walks. But Margaret Thornfield never came to visit. I noticed her driving slowly past our house more frequently, always alone, always with a clipboard on her passenger seat. Sometimes she would stop and take photographs from the street, though I couldn't imagine what architectural violations she thought she was documenting. The first HOA letter about the dock arrived 2 weeks after construction was complete. It was brief and seemingly reasonable. Request for Architectural Review Committee documentation regarding recent lakefront structure addition. I responded immediately with copies of all county permits, construction plans, and contractor certifications. The second letter arrived a month later. Incomplete documentation regarding HOA approval process for lakefront modifications. This one was more aggressive in tone, though still veiled in bureaucratic politeness. I called Margaret directly, assuming there had been some miscommunication. I wasn't aware that dock construction required separate HOA approval beyond county permits, I explained during our brief phone conversation. All structural modifications require Architectural Review Committee approval, she replied curtly. It's clearly stated in the community guidelines. I spent that evening reading through the HOA documents we'd received when purchasing our house. The guidelines were extensive and written in dense legal language, but I found the relevant section. Major structural modifications to properties require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The definition of major structural modifications was vague enough to be interpreted broadly, but docks weren't specifically mentioned. "They're fishing," Sarah said after I explained the situation. "The dock is beautiful, it's completely legal, and it doesn't hurt anyone. They're just looking for something to complain about." What we didn't realize was that Margaret Thornfield wasn't fishing at all. She was building a case, and that modest wooden dock extending into the peaceful waters of Lake Harmony was about to become ground zero for a war that would reshape our entire community. The harassment began as a whisper, but would soon become a roar. And what I didn't know was that this dock, built with love, crafted with care, permitted through proper channels, would become their obsession and my battlefield. The letters started arriving like clockwork, every Tuesday at 10 a.m., delivered with the same mechanical precision as mortgage statements or utility bills. But unlike those predictable pieces of mail, each HOA envelope carried fresh creative cruelty that left me wondering what new violation they'd invented while I slept. The third letter about the dock came 6 weeks after our phone conversation. This time, Margaret had escalated to official violation status, with a formal demand for immediate cessation of unauthorized lakefront activities pending Architectural Review Committee determination. The language had grown more aggressive, more legal, more threatening. A $25 daily fine would begin accumulating if I failed to cease and desist all dock usage within 10 days. I called an emergency meeting with the Architectural Review Committee, which turned out to consist of Margaret Thornfield and two neighbors I'd never met, the Kramers from the far end of the development who rarely participated in community events. The meeting was held in Margaret's living room, a sterile space decorated in beiges and grays that matched her personality. The committee has determined that your dock violates Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines regarding aesthetic harmony with existing neighborhood character, Margaret announced without preamble, reading from a prepared statement as if I were a stranger rather than a neighbor she'd welcomed with cookies just 2 years earlier. Which existing docks was mine compared against? I asked, genuinely confused. Several other houses around the lake had docks, some much larger and more elaborate than mine. Mrs. Kramer consulted her notes with theatrical precision. Previous dock installations were grandfathered under earlier guidelines. New construction must meet updated aesthetic standards. What specific aesthetic standards does my dock violate? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Margaret cleared her throat. The committee reserves the right to make determinations based on overall community impact and visual coherence. It was bureaucratic nonsense, a word salad, designed to sound official while saying absolutely nothing. My dock looked almost identical to the Hendersons' dock 3 houses down, built from the same materials by the same contractor. The only difference was that theirs had been constructed 1 year before some arbitrary updated guidelines that seemed to exist solely to target new construction. The daily fines began accumulating, $25 per day, every day, for using my own dock on my own property with county-approved permits. Within 2 weeks, I owed the HOA $350. By the end of the month, it was $775. The absurdity was breathtaking, but the financial pressure was real. Then the late-night drive-bys started. The first time I noticed Margaret's silver Honda Civic creeping past our house at 11 p.m., I assumed it was coincidental. But when it happened 3 nights in a row, always the same slow crawl past our property with her interior light on and a clipboard visible on her dashboard, the pattern became unmistakable. She was documenting something, photographing something, building some kind of case against us under cover of darkness. The sound of tires on gravel became a trigger for anxiety. Sarah would tense whenever headlights swept across our bedroom window after 10 p.m. Emma asked why the mean lady kept driving past our house when she was supposed to be sleeping. Our peaceful lakefront retreat was beginning to feel like a prison under constant surveillance. Other violations began multiplying like weeds. Our outdoor furniture was positioned inconsistently with neighborhood standards. Our boat, stored legally on a trailer in our driveway, was deemed visually disruptive to street aesthetics. The small fire pit, where we'd roasted marshmallows with Emma, was suddenly an unauthorized recreational structure requiring committee approval. Each violation came with escalating fines and increasingly aggressive language. The letters began arriving twice weekly, then daily. Margaret's signature became as familiar as my own family's handwriting, appearing on documents that threatened everything from property liens to foreclosure proceedings if we failed to comply with their ever-expanding list of demands. The psychological toll was worse than the financial pressure. I began checking the mailbox with the same dread most people reserve for medical test results. Sarah stopped inviting friends over, embarrassed by the constant stream of violation notices and worried that any gathering might trigger new complaints about excessive visitor parking or noise disruption. Neighbors started avoiding eye contact during evening walks around the lake. The community that had embraced us so warmly 2 years earlier was fracturing under the weight of fear. People who had been friends began viewing each other as potential sources of HOA complaints. The block parties stopped. The spontaneous conversations by the mailboxes ended. Margaret's reign of bureaucratic terror was poisoning the very community spirit she claimed to protect. Tom Henderson pulled me aside one evening as I was checking our dock for whatever new violation might have been invented while I was at work. "This is insane, David," he said, glancing nervously toward Margaret's house as if she might be watching from the windows. "She's targeting you specifically. We all see it. Then why won't anyone say something at the HOA meetings?" Tom's face showed the same conflict I'd seen in other neighbors. The desire to help warring with the fear of becoming the next target. "She's got files on everyone. Photographs, documented violations going back years that she's never acted on. If we speak up for you, she'll come after us next." The revelation was chilling. Margaret wasn't just harassing me, she was systematically collecting ammunition against every homeowner in the development, building an arsenal of potential violations she could deploy against anyone who dared to oppose her authority. Mrs. Patterson confirmed Tom's suspicions a few days later. The elderly woman appeared at our back door one evening, glancing around nervously before slipping inside our kitchen. "She's got photographs of my rose garden from when it was 6 inches into the setback zone 3 summers ago," Mrs. Patterson whispered, as if Margaret might be listening through the walls. "Photos of the Hendersons' Christmas lights that were up until January 5th 2 years back. She never said anything at the time, but she's been building files on all of us." The scope of Margaret's operation was becoming clear. She wasn't enforcing HOA rules. She was stockpiling weapons for a war against her own neighbors. Every friendly conversation, every moment of community joy, every small deviation from her arbitrary standards was being documented and catalogued for future use. The final escalation came on a Thursday evening in October. I was grilling dinner on our deck when Margaret's car pulled directly into our driveway. No longer content with curbside surveillance, she emerged with a measuring tape and clipboard, marching across our lawn toward the dock as if she owned the property. "Excuse me," I called, abandoning the grill and hurrying toward the shoreline. "You're on private property." Margaret didn't look up from her measuring tape. HOA enforcement activities are permitted under Section 12.3 of the Community Agreements. I'm documenting safety violations for the county inspector. "What safety violations?" She gestured vaguely at the dock's railings. "Insufficient height clearance, improper spacing between support posts, potential environmental hazard to lake ecosystem." Every word was fabricated nonsense. The dock had passed county inspection with flying colors just months earlier. But Margaret was creating an official record of violations that existed only in her imagination, building toward some endgame that was becoming increasingly clear. That night, I found Sarah crying in our bedroom, the first time I'd seen her break down since this ordeal began. "I can't take much more of this," she whispered. "It's like we're being stalked in our own home." Emma's started having nightmares about the clipboard lady taking our house away. I held my wife and stared out our bedroom window at the dock silhouetted against the moonlit lake. The peaceful structure that was supposed to bring our family joy had become the symbol of our persecution. Margaret Thornfield and her HOA board were systematically destroying our lives, our finances, and our sense of security. But they were also making a critical mistake. With every excessive fine, every midnight drive-by, every fabricated violation, they were creating a paper trail of harassment that would eventually serve as evidence of their abuse of power. They thought they were building an unassailable case against me. What they were actually doing was handing me the documentation I would need to destroy them completely. The war was escalating, and Margaret had no idea that her obsession with my dock was about to become the instrument of her own downfall. But first, I would receive one final notice that would either break my spirit entirely or forge it into an unbreakable weapon. That notice was still 3 weeks away, and it would demand not hundreds or thousands of dollars, but an amount so astronomical, so obscenely punitive, that it would transform me from victim to warrior overnight. The breaking point came on the morning I realized that fighting fire with fire wasn't enough. I needed to fight it with an earthquake. 3 weeks after Margaret's trespassing incident, the certified letter arrived demanding $100,000. But instead of curling up in defeat or hiring a lawyer I couldn't afford, something colder and more calculated took hold of me. If Margaret Thornfield wanted to play bureaucratic warfare, I would master the rules better than she ever could. That evening, while Sarah put Emma to bed with reassuring lies about everything being okay, I spread every HOA document across our dining room table like a general mapping a battlefield. The community charter, the bylaws, the architectural guidelines, the fee structures, the violation procedures, everything that governed our little lakefront kingdom. If there was a weapon hidden in this bureaucratic maze, I was going to find it. The first thing I discovered was that Margaret had made procedural errors in almost every violation notice she'd sent. Incorrect reference codes, missed notification timelines, violations that didn't actually exist in the written guidelines. She'd been so confident in her authority that she'd gotten sloppy, assuming no one would ever challenge her interpretations. But those were small victories. I needed something bigger, something that could end this war decisively, rather than just winning individual battles. I started with the fee structure documents, the dry, technical papers that outlined how HOA dues were calculated, how special assessments worked, how penalty revenues were handled. Most homeowners never read these sections because they were mind-numbingly boring, filled with accounting terminology and legal references that seemed designed to discourage scrutiny. That's where Margaret had made her fatal mistake. Buried in Section 8.4 of the Community Charter, subsection C, paragraph 3, I found it. A single sentence that had probably seemed insignificant when it was written, a bit of legal boilerplate designed to ensure fiscal responsibility. In the event that accumulated violation penalties exceed 15% of the annual operating budget in any given fiscal year, all homeowner assessment fees shall be recalculated proportionally to ensure budget stability, with implementation occurring within 30 days of threshold achievement. I read it 3 times, my heart pounding as the implications became clear. The HOA's annual operating budget was $67,000. I knew this because it was published in the quarterly newsletters that Margaret insisted on sending to demonstrate her fiscal responsibility. 15% of $67,000 was just over $10,000. My accumulated fines alone already exceeded $8,000. Add in the penalties. They'd assessed against the Hendersons for their unauthorized garden gnome, Fatal 200, Mrs. Patterson's rose garden violations, 800, and the dozen other neighbors who'd been systematically harassed over the past year. And we were already approaching that critical threshold. But here was the beautiful part. My $100,000 fine, if it stood, would trigger the recalculation clause immediately. And according to the fee structure formula outlined in the following subsections, the math was devastatingly simple. The HOA's operating budget would need to increase to cover the massive penalty revenues they claimed to be owed. But the recalculation formula worked both ways. If penalty revenues spiked dramatically, homeowner fees had to be adjusted to maintain the legal balance between penalty income and assessment income mandated by state HOA regulations. I pulled out my calculator and ran the numbers 3 times, certain I had to be making an error. But the math was irrefutable. If my $100,000 fine was legitimate and enforceable, the automatic fee recalculation would increase every homeowner's annual assessment by approximately $15,000. For a community of 67 households, that meant the total annual fees would jump from the current $1,200 per household to over $16,000 per household. Margaret and her HOA board had been so focused on punishing me that they'd never considered the structural consequences of their own greed. They'd created a financial weapon of mass destruction and handed me the trigger. But I needed to be absolutely certain before I deployed this nuclear option. The next morning, I called the county clerk's office and requested copies of all filed HOA documents for Sunset Lakes development. What I discovered was that our community charter was actually more restrictive than most, written by overly cautious lawyers who'd inserted multiple fiscal responsibility clauses to prevent exactly the kind of financial mismanagement that Margaret was now engaging in. I also discovered that 3 other homeowners had requested the same documents in recent months: Tom Henderson, Mrs. Patterson, and, surprisingly, Robert Kramer, one of Margaret's own Architectural Review Committee members. We weren't the only ones who'd started digging into the legal foundation of Margaret's authority. The most crucial discovery came when I cross-referenced our HOA charter with state regulations governing homeowner associations. Our charter had been written in 2003, when state laws were much more lenient about HOA enforcement powers. But newer state regulations, updated just 2 years earlier, had imposed strict limitations on penalty structures and fee assessment procedures that our outdated charter didn't account for. According to current state law, any single penalty exceeding $5,000 required a formal hearing with legal representation allowed for the homeowner. Any penalty exceeding $10,000 required approval from a majority vote of all community homeowners, not just the HOA board. And any penalty that triggered automatic fee recalculations had to be disclosed to all homeowners at least 60 days before implementation. Margaret had violated every single one of these requirements. I spent the next week quietly documenting everything, photographing relevant charter sections, printing state regulations, creating a timeline of violations and procedural errors that painted a clear picture of systematic harassment and illegal fee assessment practices. But I still needed allies. The nuclear option would work, but only if I could ensure that the community understood exactly what Margaret had done and why the dramatic fee increase was her fault. Not mine. Tom Henderson was my first recruit. When I knocked on his door that Saturday morning and laid out the documents on his kitchen table, his face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, understanding, anger, and finally, grim satisfaction. She really did this to herself, he breathed, studying the fee calculation formulas. Every household in the community is going to see a massive assessment increase because of her vendetta against you. Only if the $100,000 fine stands, I clarified. If she withdraws it and apologizes, none of this has to happen. Tom's smile was sharp. Do you really think Margaret Thornfield is going to back down and admit she was wrong? We both knew the answer. Margaret's pride and need for control would never allow her to retreat, even when retreat was her only rational option. She would double down, insist the fine was legitimate, and walk straight into the trap she'd built for herself. Mrs. Patterson joined our small resistance the next day, followed by the Yamadas from Pine Street and the young Moretti family who'd been terrorized over their children's sidewalk chalk art. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial disbelief, careful review of the documents, and growing excitement as they realized that Margaret's own greed had created the weapon for her downfall. The most surprising recruit was Robert Kramer himself. Margaret's own committee member appeared at my door on Wednesday evening, looking haggard and apologetic. "I need you to know I never agreed to any of this," he said without preamble. "Margaret told us the $100,000 fine was approved by legal counsel and required by state law. I didn't find out she'd fabricated the whole thing until I requested the legal opinions myself." Robert had discovered that Margaret had been forging committee approvals for months, using fake legal justifications to support increasingly aggressive enforcement actions. She'd been operating as a dictator while maintaining the fiction of committee oversight. "How many others know?" I asked, At least half the community suspects something's wrong. People are scared to speak up because they think she has legal authority behind her. But if they knew the truth, by Friday evening, we had quietly assembled a coalition of 23 households, more than enough to demand a special community meeting and potentially remove Margaret from the HOA board entirely. But I convinced the group to wait. Let her present the $100,000 fine at the next regular meeting, I suggested. Let her defend it publicly, in front of everyone, with full confidence that her authority is unquestionable. And then we'll show the community exactly what her greed is going to cost every single one of them. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, 7 days for Margaret to prepare her defense of the indefensible. 7 days for our coalition to quietly spread the word about what was really happening. 7 days for the community to understand that their choice wasn't between supporting me or supporting law and order. It was between stopping a tyrant or paying for her tyranny with their own money Margaret had spent 2 years building. Her empire of fear and control. She'd systematically harassed neighbors, accumulated illegal penalties, and violated state regulations with impunity. But in her greed and arrogance, she'd also written the blueprint for her own destruction. The hidden clause that would trigger the massive fee increase wasn't really hidden at all. It was sitting in plain sight in documents that every homeowner had received, but none had bothered to read carefully. Margaret's greatest strength, her mastery of bureaucratic intimidation, was about to become her fatal weakness. The war was about to end, but Margaret didn't know it yet. She thought she was walking into a routine HOA meeting to rubber stamp another victory in her campaign of harassment. Instead, she was walking into an ambush that would destroy her authority, expose her illegal actions, and transform her from neighborhood tyrant to community pariah in a single evening. The dock that had started this whole conflict still stretched peacefully into Lake Harmony, but it was no longer a symbol of Margaret's power over me. It had become the monument to her downfall. The community center on Maple Street had never felt more like a courtroom than it did the Tuesday evening before our scheduled showdown. But this wasn't where we were holding our clandestine meeting. That was happening in Tom Henderson's garage, behind closed doors, with cars parked 3 blocks away to avoid drawing Margaret's attention. 27 neighbors had quietly assembled by 8 p.m., more than I'd dared hope for. They arrived separately, at staggered intervals, carrying casseroles and covered dishes, as if attending a potluck rather than planning a revolution. The familiar smell of Mrs. Patterson's apple pie, mixing with the Yamada's homemade spring rolls, created an oddly festive atmosphere for what amounted to a war council. Before we start, I addressed the group gathered among Tom's lawnmowers and Christmas decorations. Everyone needs to understand what we're really doing here. We're not just fighting my $100,000 fine. We're exposing systematic abuse of authority that's been terrorizing this entire community for 2 years. Robert Kramer stepped forward, his face drawn with the exhaustion of a man carrying heavy guilt. As Margaret's own committee member, his presence lent credibility that I couldn't provide alone. I need to be completely honest about what I've discovered, Robert began, pulling out a manila folder thick with documents. Margaret has been forging Architectural Review Committee approvals for over 18 months. She's been claiming unanimous committee support for decisions that Linda and I never voted on, never even heard about, until after the violation notices were sent. The garage fell silent, except for the hum of Tom's old refrigerator. Linda Kramer nodded miserably beside her husband. We thought we were just rubber-stamping legitimate violations, Linda added. Margaret would email us summaries of obvious infractions and ask for our approval. We trusted her expertise and legal knowledge. We never realized she was escalating minor issues into major penalties, or that she was completely fabricating some violations. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand tentatively. What about my roses? Margaret showed me photographs proving they violated setback requirements. Robert consulted his notes. Margaret used a measuring tape placed at an angle to make your roses appear closer to the property line than they actually were. The same technique she used for the Hendersons' fence and David's dock positioning. She's been systematically creating photographic evidence to support violations that don't exist. The murmur that rippled through the garage carried equal parts anger and amazement. Margaret hadn't just been overzealous in her enforcement. She'd been actively manufacturing violations to justify her harassment campaign. Tom Henderson spread architectural drawings across his workbench, blueprints he'd obtained from the county planning office. Look at this. Every dock on the lake was built to the same specifications by the same contractor. The county approved identical designs for all of us. But Margaret claimed David's dock violated aesthetic harmony standards that she invented, specifically to target him. Sarah Martinez from Oak Lane studied the blueprints with the careful attention of someone who'd been living in fear of her own manufactured violations. So none of the architectural review decisions from the past 18 months were legitimate? None, Robert confirmed. And according to state law, forged committee approvals invalidate all associated penalties and fines. Every violation notice Margaret sent, based on fake committee consensus, is legally void. The implications were staggering. Thousands of dollars in accumulated fines, months of stress and harassment, neighbors turning against each other out of fear. All of it based on fabricated authority and manufactured violations. But our most valuable ally arrived last, slipping through Tom's back door just as we were reviewing the fee recalculation documents. Janet Morrison had moved to Sunset Lakes only 6 months earlier, but her background as a retired municipal attorney made her perspective invaluable. I've been reviewing the HOA charter and state regulations since Robert reached out to me yesterday, Janet announced, settling into a folding chair with the confident air of someone accustomed to legal battlefields. Margaret has violated so many procedural requirements that your entire HOA charter might be subject to state supervision. She opened a legal pad covered in precise handwriting. Unauthorized penalty structures, failure to provide required legal notifications, forged committee approvals, violation of due process requirements. Any one of these would be grounds for state intervention. Together, they constitute a pattern of systematic fraud. Janet's words carried the weight of legal authority that our group had been lacking. We weren't just angry homeowners anymore. We were citizens with legitimate grounds for demanding justice. "What happens to the $100,000 fine?" asked Mike Yamada, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Janet smiled grimly. "Legally, it's completely unenforceable. Margaret has no authority to assess penalties above $500 without committee approval and legal review. But here's the beautiful part. She doesn't know that. And if she presents this fine at Thursday's meeting as legitimate, she's committing fraud in front of witnesses." The strategy crystallized as Janet outlined the legal framework. We wouldn't just defeat Margaret's fine, we would expose her entire operation as a criminal enterprise disguised as community governance. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a notebook where she'd been documenting every HOA interaction for the past year. "I've got photographs of Margaret trespassing on properties, copies of every violation notice with timestamps showing procedural violations, even recordings of phone conversations where she threatened foreclosure without legal basis." Other neighbors began producing their own evidence. The Morettis had doorbell camera footage of Margaret measuring their driveway at midnight. The Hendersons had email correspondence proving Margaret had misrepresented committee decisions. Sarah Martinez had documented how Margaret's violations always seemed to target households with children, minorities, or anyone who'd ever questioned her authority. "She's been running a protection racket disguised as an HOA," Tom Henderson summarized. "Pay her fines and follow her arbitrary rules, or face escalating harassment until you're forced to sell your house and leave. The evidence was overwhelming, but Janet warned us about overconfidence. Margaret still has supporters in the community, she cautioned. People who've avoided her harassment by staying silent and following every rule. They might see our resistance as troublemaking rather than justice. We need to make sure Thursday's presentation focuses on the financial impact to every household, not just the legal violations. This was crucial strategic advice. Many neighbors might tolerate Margaret's tyranny as long as it didn't directly cost them money. But when they realized that her $100,000 fine would trigger massive fee increases for everyone, self-interest would align with justice. We spent the next hour rehearsing the presentation. I would speak first, calmly explaining the fee recalculation clause and its automatic trigger. Janet would follow with the legal analysis, demonstrating why the fine was unenforceable. Robert would present evidence of forged committee approvals. Mrs. Patterson would share documentation of systematic harassment. The goal wasn't to humiliate Margaret personally, but to expose the institutional corruption she'd created and demand immediate structural reforms to prevent future abuse. What if she tries to withdraw the fine when she realizes what's happening? Asked Linda Kramer. Janet's expression was steely. Too late for that. She's already committed to presenting it at the meeting. State law requires that any penalty above $5,000 be formally presented to the community before implementation. If she withdraws it now, she's admitting she never had authority to assess it in the first place. As the meeting broke up around 10 p.m., neighbors dispersed into the darkness with the quiet determination of people who'd finally found a way to fight back against injustice. Cars started at different times, headlights pointing in various directions, maintaining the illusion that this had been a casual social gathering rather than a carefully orchestrated resistance movement. I was the last to leave, helping Tom stack chairs and clean up evidence of our clandestine gathering. "You know she's going to fight dirty when she realizes what's happening," Tom warned as we secured his garage door. "She's been fighting dirty for 2 years," I replied. "The only difference is that now we're fighting back." Walking home under the stars reflected in Lake Harmony's still water, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this ordeal began. Genuine hope. Not just hope that I would survive Margaret's attack, but confidence that we were going to end her reign of terror completely. The dock stretched into the moonlit lake, no longer a source of anxiety but a symbol of resistance. Every board, every nail, every permit stamp represented our right to live peacefully in our own homes without fear of arbitrary punishment. Thursday's meeting was still 2 days away, but Margaret had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. The community that she'd tried to rule through fear and intimidation was about to remind her that in America, even HOA presidents are accountable to the people they claim to serve. And sometimes, the very weapons tyrants use against their victims become the instruments of their own destruction. The Sunset Lakes Community Center had never hosted a crowd like the one that gathered on Thursday evening, November 15th. Every folding chair was occupied, with additional neighbors standing along the walls and clustering near the windows. The usual monthly attendance of 8 to 12. Homeowners had swelled to over 60 people. Nearly every household in our development represented by at least one family member, Margaret. Thornfield sat at the front table with her usual props: 3 binders of documents, a digital timer to enforce speaking limits, and a gavel she'd purchased online to add gravitas to her pronouncements. But something was different in her demeanor tonight. Her typical smugness was edged with wariness as she surveyed the unexpectedly large crowd. "I call this meeting to order," Margaret announced, striking her gavel with more force than necessary. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. Tonight's agenda includes several routine matters and one significant enforcement action regarding ongoing violations at 447 Lakeshore Drive. My address. She was making this personal from the opening statement. framing the $100,000 fine as the evening's main event, rather than burying it among routine business. Perfect. Her ego was ensuring maximum exposure for her own downfall. Before we proceed with regular business, Margaret continued, consulting her notes with theatrical precision, I want to address some concerning rumors that have been circulating in our community. Some residents have been spreading misinformation about HOA procedures and questioning the authority of the Architectural Review Committee. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret was already on the defensive, trying to preemptively discredit opposition before anyone had even spoken. She sensed the shift in community dynamics, but didn't understand its source. Our HOA operates under strict legal guidelines designed to protect property values and maintain community standards. Tonight's enforcement action represents a necessary response to willful, repeated violations that threaten the character of our neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand tentatively. What about my roses? Margaret showed me photographs proving they violated setback requirements. Robert consulted his notes. Margaret used a measuring tape placed at an angle to make your roses appear closer to the property line than they actually were. The same technique she used for the Henderson's fence and David's dock positioning. She's been systematically creating photographic evidence to support violations that don't exist. The murmur that rippled through the garage carried equal parts anger and amazement. Margaret hadn't just been overzealous in her enforcement. She'd been actively manufacturing violations to justify her harassment campaign. Tom Henderson spread architectural drawings across his workbench, blueprints he'd obtained from the county planning office. Look at this. Every dock on the lake was built to the same specifications by the same contractor. The county approved identical designs for all of us. But Margaret claimed David's dock violated aesthetic harmony standards that she invented, specifically to target him. Sarah Martinez from Oak Lane studied the blueprints with the careful attention of someone who'd been living in fear of her own manufactured violations. So none of the architectural review decisions from the past 18 months were legitimate? None, Robert confirmed. And according to state law, forged committee approvals invalidate all associated penalties and fines. Every violation notice Margaret sent, based on fake committee consensus, is legally void. The implications were staggering. Thousands of dollars in accumulated fines, months of stress and harassment, neighbors turning against each other out of fear. All of it based on fabricated authority and manufactured violations. But our most valuable ally arrived last, slipping through Tom's back door just as we were reviewing the fee recalculation documents. Janet Morrison had moved to Sunset Lakes only 6 months earlier, but her background as a retired municipal attorney made her perspective invaluable. I've been reviewing the HOA charter and state regulations since Robert reached out to me yesterday, Janet announced, settling into a folding chair with the confident air of someone accustomed to legal battlefields. Margaret has violated so many procedural requirements that your entire HOA charter might be subject to state supervision. She opened a legal pad covered in precise handwriting. Unauthorized penalty structures, failure to provide required legal notifications, forged committee approvals, violation of due process requirements. Any one of these would be grounds for state intervention. Together, they constitute a pattern of systematic fraud. Janet's words carried the weight of legal authority that our group had been lacking. We weren't just angry homeowners anymore. We were citizens with legitimate grounds for demanding justice. What happens to the $100,000 fine? Asked Mike Yamada, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Janet smiled grimly. Legally, it's completely unenforceable. Margaret has no authority to assess penalties above $500 without committee approval and legal review. But here's the beautiful part. She doesn't know that. And if she presents this fine at Thursday's meeting as legitimate, she's committing fraud in front of witnesses. The strategy crystallized as Janet outlined the legal framework. We wouldn't just defeat Margaret's fine, we would expose her entire operation as a criminal enterprise disguised as community governance. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a notebook where she'd been documenting every HOA interaction for the past year. I've got photographs of Margaret trespassing on properties, copies of every violation notice with timestamps showing procedural violations, even recordings of phone conversations where she threatened foreclosure without legal basis. Other neighbors began producing their own evidence. The Morettis had doorbell camera footage of Margaret measuring their driveway at midnight. The Hendersons had email correspondence proving Margaret had misrepresented committee decisions. Sarah Martinez had documented how Margaret's violations always seemed to target households with children, minorities, or anyone who'd ever questioned her authority. She's been running a protection racket disguised as an HOA, Tom Henderson summarized. Pay her fines and follow her arbitrary rules, or face escalating harassment until you're forced to sell your house and leave. The evidence was overwhelming, but Janet warned us about overconfidence. Margaret still has supporters in the community, she cautioned. People who've avoided her harassment by staying silent and following every rule. They might see our resistance as troublemaking rather than justice. We need to make sure Thursday's presentation focuses on the financial impact to every household, not just the legal violations. This was crucial strategic advice. Many neighbors might tolerate Margaret's tyranny as long as it didn't directly cost them money. But when they realized that her $100,000 fine would trigger massive fee increases for everyone, self-interest would align with justice. We spent the next hour rehearsing the presentation. I would speak first, calmly explaining the fee recalculation clause and its automatic trigger. Janet would follow with the legal analysis, demonstrating why the fine was unenforceable. Robert would present evidence of forged committee approvals. Mrs. Patterson would share documentation of systematic harassment. The goal wasn't to humiliate Margaret personally, but to expose the institutional corruption she'd created and demand immediate structural reforms to prevent future abuse. What if she tries to withdraw the fine when she realizes what's happening? Asked Linda Kramer. Janet's expression was steely. Too late for that. She's already committed to presenting it at the meeting. State law requires that any penalty above $5,000 be formally presented to the community before implementation. If she withdraws it now, she's admitting she never had authority to assess it in the first place. As the meeting broke up around 10 p.m., neighbors dispersed into the darkness with the quiet determination of people who'd finally found a way to fight back against injustice. Cars started at different times, headlights pointing in various directions, maintaining the illusion that this had been a casual social gathering rather than a carefully orchestrated resistance movement. I was the last to leave, helping Tom stack chairs and clean up evidence of our clandestine gathering. You know she's going to fight dirty when she realizes what's happening, Tom warned as we secured his garage door. She's been fighting dirty for 2 years, I replied. The only difference is that now we're fighting back. Walking home under the stars reflected in Lake Harmony's still water, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this ordeal began. Genuine hope. Not just hope that I would survive Margaret's attack, but confidence that we were going to end her reign of terror completely. The dock stretched into the moonlit lake, no longer a source of anxiety but a symbol of resistance. Every board, every nail, every permit stamp represented our right to live peacefully in our own homes without fear of arbitrary punishment. Thursday's meeting was still 2 days away, but Margaret had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. The community that she'd tried to rule through fear and intimidation was about to remind her that in America, even HOA presidents are accountable to the people they claim to serve. And sometimes, the very weapons tyrants use against their victims become the instruments of their own destruction. The Sunset Lakes Community Center had never hosted a crowd like the one that gathered on Thursday evening, November 15th. Every folding chair was occupied, with additional neighbors standing along the walls and clustering near the windows. The usual monthly attendance of 8 to 12. Homeowners had swelled to over 60 people. Nearly every household in our development represented by at least one family member, Margaret. Thornfield sat at the front table with her usual props: 3 binders of documents, a digital timer to enforce speaking limits, and a gavel she'd purchased online to add gravitas to her pronouncements. But something was different in her demeanor tonight. Her typical smugness was edged with wariness as she surveyed the unexpectedly large crowd. "I call this meeting to order," Margaret announced, striking her gavel with more force than necessary. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. Tonight's agenda includes several routine matters and one significant enforcement action regarding ongoing violations at 447 Lakeshore Drive. My address. She was making this personal from the opening statement, framing the $100,000 fine as the evening's main event, rather than burying it among routine business. Perfect. Her ego was ensuring maximum exposure for her own downfall. "Before we proceed with regular business," Margaret continued, consulting her notes with theatrical precision, "I want to address some concerning rumors that have been circulating in our community. Some residents have been spreading misinformation about HOA procedures and questioning the authority of the Architectural Review Committee." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret was already on the defensive, trying to preemptively discredit opposition before anyone had even spoken. She sensed the shift in community dynamics, but didn't understand its source. Our HOA operates under strict legal guidelines designed to protect property values and maintain community standards. Tonight's enforcement action represents a necessary response to willful, repeated violations that threaten the character of our neighborhood. This is exactly the kind of property rights violation that destroys the American dream, declared Channel 7's consumer advocate reporter, standing on my dock with Lake Harmony sparkling in the background. "A family builds their dream home, follows all county regulations, and gets financially destroyed by their own neighbors over bureaucratic technicalities." The irony was perfect. Margaret's attempts to punish me had instead created a public relations nightmare for the entire concept of HOA governance. By Friday, the story had been picked up by national news outlets, with Sunset Lakes becoming a poster child for HOA reform legislation pending in the state legislature. But the media attention was just the beginning of Margaret's problems. Janet Morrison had spent Thursday night researching state regulations governing HOA fraud, and what she discovered Friday morning changed everything. Margaret's systematic forgery of committee approvals didn't just invalidate the penalties she'd assessed, it triggered automatic state oversight of our entire community charter. The State Attorney General's office has opened a formal investigation, Janet announced at an emergency community meeting we'd called for Saturday morning. When HOA boards engage in systematic fraud, the state can impose supervised management until new elections are held and proper procedures are established. This meant that every decision Margaret had made over the past 18 months was subject to legal review. Every fine, every violation notice, every threat of foreclosure would be examined by state investigators who specialized in HOA abuse cases. The financial implications were staggering. Robert Kramer had spent Friday reviewing HOA accounting records and discovered that Margaret had been using penalty revenues to fund personal expenses disguised as administrative costs. Professional cleaning for her house was billed as office maintenance. Her monthly spa appointments were classified as stress management for HOA officials. Even her car payments were being covered through creative interpretation of transportation allowances for community oversight activities. She's embezzled at least $23,000 over the past year, Robert reported to the packed community center. And that's just what I can document from the records she didn't destroy before fleeing. Margaret had indeed fled. Her house on Pine Street stood empty by Saturday morning, with a "For Sale by Owner" sign hastily planted in her front yard. Neighbors reported seeing her loading boxes into a moving truck at 3 a.m. Friday night, apparently hoping to escape before the full extent of her fraud became public knowledge. But you can't outrun state investigators, and Margaret's attempt to flee only made her legal situation worse. By Monday, the Attorney General's office had issued a warrant for her arrest on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and violation of fiduciary duties under state HOA governance laws. The community's healing process began almost immediately, but it revealed how deeply Margaret's surveillance state had damaged neighborhood relationships. Families who'd been friends for years had been turned against each other by manufactured disputes and fabricated violations. Children had stopped playing together because their parents were afraid of triggering new HOA complaints. Mrs. Patterson hosted the first reconciliation coffee in her backyard Tuesday morning, inviting everyone who'd been targeted by Margaret's harassment campaign. 23 households showed up, sharing stories that revealed the systematic nature of Margaret's psychological warfare. "She told me that you complained about my wind chimes," Mrs. Patterson said to Sarah Martinez, gesturing toward the delicate ceramic pieces that hung from her porch. "I never complained about anything," Sarah replied, shaking her head in amazement. "She told me you were upset about our children's bicycles on the sidewalk." Similar conversations were happening throughout the gathering. Margaret had been playing neighbors against each other, fabricating complaints, and attributing them to innocent community members to create isolation and distrust. It was psychological manipulation on a scale that bordered on sociopathic. The Hendersons revealed that Margaret had tried to recruit them as community liaisons to report on their neighbors' activities. When they refused, their property became subject to increasingly aggressive violation notices until they stopped socializing with other families entirely. "She was systematically destroying our sense of community," Tom Henderson observed, "not just enforcing rules, but actively preventing us from connecting with each other." Isolated people are easier to control. The financial recovery process was more complex. Janet Morrison was working with the state investigators to determine which fines and penalties could be legally voided, but the embezzled funds were harder to recover. Margaret's house was already under contract, but most of the equity would likely be consumed by legal fees and restitution requirements. More problematically, the automatic fee recalculation clause that would have triggered massive assessment increases was still technically in effect until the state completed its review of our community charter. We were in legal limbo, with unclear obligations and uncertain financial responsibilities. The good news is that the $100,000 fine is completely void, Janet explained at Wednesday's emergency meeting, along with all other penalties assessed without proper committee approval. The bad news is that we need to operate under state supervision until new community bylaws are approved and new elections are held. This meant temporary managers appointed by the state attorney general's office would be handling HOA functions for at least 6 months while investigators completed their review and community members drafted new governance documents. But the most satisfying development came Thursday afternoon, when Margaret Thornfield was arrested at a hotel in neighboring Riverside County. The local news footage showed her being led away in handcuffs while trying to hide her face behind a clipboard, the same prop she'd used to terrorize an entire neighborhood. Former HOA. "President charged with embezzlement and fraud," read the headline in Friday's newspaper. The article detailed how a single homeowner's resistance to an illegitimate fine had exposed systematic corruption that affected dozens of families and involved theft of community funds. The story had legs because it represented a perfect case study of how unchecked authority corrupts even small-scale institutions. Margaret hadn't started as a criminal. She'd begun as an overzealous volunteer who gradually convinced herself that her personal preferences deserved the force of law. By the following week, our story was being referenced in state legislative hearings about HOA reform. Representatives used Sunset Lakes as an example of why stronger oversight and clearer procedural requirements were needed to prevent future abuse cases. No, homeowners should face financial ruin because a power-hungry neighbor decides to weaponize community governance, declared State Representative Maria Santos during televised committee hearings. The Sunset Lakes case shows how quickly HOA authority can become HOA tyranny when proper checks and balances don't exist. The dock that had started this entire conflict became something of a local landmark. Visitors would drive through our development specifically to see the famous HOA dock that had triggered such a dramatic exposure of community corruption. Emma thought it was hilarious that tourists were taking pictures of our family's fishing spot, but the real transformation was in the community itself. Without Margaret's surveillance and intimidation, neighbors began connecting in ways that hadn't been possible for years. Spontaneous gatherings returned to the lake shores. Children's laughter echoed across the water again. The community garden that had been abandoned under Margaret's rule was replanted with enthusiastic volunteer participation. It's like someone lifted a fog that we didn't even realize was choking us, Sarah observed one evening as we watched Emma fishing from the dock while neighborhood kids played in the shallows nearby. The state investigators completed their preliminary report 6 weeks after Margaret's arrest, documenting violations of 17 different HOA governance regulations and recommending criminal charges on 12 counts of fraud and embezzlement. But more importantly, their report became a model for identifying and preventing similar abuse in other communities. Margaret's empire of fear and control had collapsed completely, but its destruction had revealed something beautiful underneath. A genuine community of families who wanted to live peacefully beside a lake, raise their children safely, and help their neighbors when needed. The dock stretched into the winter quiet water, no longer a symbol of conflict, but a reminder that sometimes the very weapon a tyrant chooses becomes the instrument of their own downfall. Margaret had thought she could use my family's simple desire for lakefront access to demonstrate her absolute power over the community. Instead, she demonstrated that in America, even the smallest acts of resistance can topple the mightiest bureaucratic bullies when communities find the courage to stand together against injustice. 2 years have passed since Margaret Thornfield's empire crumbled, and Lake Harmony has become something none of us expected. A model community that other neighborhoods study to understand how democracy can flourish when people refuse to be intimidated by petty tyrants. The dock still extends 30 feet into the crystal-clear water, its weathered boards now worn smooth by countless family gatherings and impromptu community meetings. What started as my family's simple fishing platform has evolved into something more significant, a symbol of the principle that in America, your neighbors can't destroy your dreams just because they disagree with your choices. Emma, now 12, has become the lake's unofficial historian. She gives tours to the steady stream of visitors who come to see the famous HOA dock, explaining to curious reporters and academic researchers how a single piece of lumber and some bureaucratic overreach triggered the downfall of a neighborhood dictator. The important part isn't that my dad won, she tells groups with the confident authority of someone who lived through historic events. The important part is that all the neighbors learned they could win when they worked together. Her understanding of the deeper lessons impresses the college students and graduate researchers who've made Sunset Lakes a case study in community governance and grassroots resistance to institutional abuse. Our story has been featured in political science textbooks and HOA reform advocacy materials across the country. But the real legacy isn't academic recognition, it's the transformation of how our community approaches the balance between individual rights and collective responsibility. The new HOA charter, drafted with input from every household and reviewed by state governance experts, bears no resemblance to the document that enabled Margaret's reign of terror. Instead of vague language about community standards and aesthetic harmony, our bylaws specify exactly what constitutes a legitimate violation, what procedures must be followed for enforcement, and what rights homeowners have during dispute resolution. Most importantly, no single individual can assess penalties above $100 without approval from a majority of community members. The Architectural Review Committee consists of 5 rotating members with term limits, and all committee meetings must be open to community observation with detailed minutes published within 48 hours. We learned that democracy dies in darkness, explains Janet Morrison, who served as our interim governance consultant before returning to retirement. Margaret's power came from operating in secret, making decisions behind closed doors, and preventing communities from understanding their own rights. Transparency isn't just good policy, it's the antidote to tyranny. The financial recovery took longer than expected. Margaret was ultimately sentenced to 2 years in state prison and ordered to pay $31,000 in restitution, but most of the embezzled funds were never recovered. However, the community decided to treat her theft as an expensive lesson in the importance of fiscal oversight rather than a permanent burden. More significantly, the state legislature passed the Sunset Lakes HOA Reform Act 18 months after our confrontation, establishing statewide standards for HOA governance that prevent the kind of systematic abuse Margaret inflicted on our neighborhood. Communities across the country have adopted similar legislation, using our experience as a template for protecting homeowner rights while maintaining legitimate community standards. The national attention brought unexpected benefits. A documentary production company paid our community a modest licensing fee for the rights to our story, with proceeds going toward lake conservation efforts and community improvement projects. The resulting film, Dock of Justice: How One Lake Community Defeated HOA. Tyranny won awards at several independent film festivals and continues generating revenue for our community maintenance fund. But the most meaningful changes are the small, daily improvements in how neighbors interact with each other. Children play freely across property lines again, without parents worrying about generating violation notices. Families host spontaneous gatherings, without fear of complaints about excessive noise or unauthorized recreational activities. The community garden thrives under collective care rather than bureaucratic micromanagement. Mrs. Patterson, now 78, has become our unofficial community grandmother, hosting weekly coffee gatherings that rotate between different households. Her rose garden, which triggered some of Margaret's most creative fabricated violations, won the County Master Gardener Award last spring. The roses were always beautiful, she says with a smile. They just needed to be free from fear to really flourish. The same could be said about our entire community. Tom and Linda Henderson finally built their own dock, using the same contractor and identical plans that had triggered Margaret's vendetta against my family. The construction process became a community celebration, with neighbors contributing labor and sharing meals during the week-long project. "It's not about the dock," Tom explained to a reporter covering the story. "It's about the right to improve your own property without having to ask permission from people who think they own your dreams." Sarah and I often sit on our dock in the evenings, watching the sun paint the water in gold and crimson, while Emma practices casting techniques she learned from Mrs. Patterson. The peaceful rhythm of water against the shoreline carries sounds that were absent during Margaret's reign. Children laughing, neighbors calling greetings across the water, the gentle splash of families enjoying the lake they work so hard to afford. "Do you ever regret fighting back?" Sarah asked one evening as we watched a great blue heron fishing in the shallows near our dock. The question deserved serious consideration. The battle with Margaret had consumed months of our lives, cost thousands in legal fees, and subjected our family to national media attention we never sought. There were easier paths we could have taken, paying her fines, removing the dock, selling our house, and starting over somewhere else. Never, I replied, meaning it completely. Margaret was counting on good people choosing the easy path over the right path. Every family that gave up and moved away, every neighbor who stayed silent to avoid becoming a target, every violation that went unchallenged because people were afraid. All of that enabled her to become more powerful and more abusive. The heron struck suddenly, emerging from the water with a silver fish writhing in its beak. Life and death, power and resistance. The eternal dance of predator and prey playing out in the natural world just as it does in human communities. Besides, I added, look around. This isn't just our victory anymore. It belongs to every family who can now live peacefully without fear of arbitrary punishment. It belongs to every community that's learned they don't have to tolerate abuse disguised as governance. It belongs to Emma and all the other children who'll grow up, understanding that tyranny only succeeds when good people remain silent. The dock has become a pilgrimage site of sorts for homeowners fighting similar battles across the country. They come seeking advice about legal strategies and community organizing, but more often they come seeking hope. Proof that David can still defeat Goliath when David has good neighbors and Goliath overreaches. Through greed and arrogance, we've hosted delegations from communities dealing with HOA abuse in Texas, Florida, Nevada, and Colorado. Each group brings their own horror stories of arbitrary fines, selective enforcement, and petty tyrants drunk on microscopic amounts of power. But they also bring determination and the growing understanding that communities don't have to tolerate systematic harassment from their own neighbors. The most important thing Margaret taught us, I tell these visiting delegations, is that bullies are usually cowards. They count on their victims being isolated and uninformed. But when communities come together, share information, and refuse to be intimidated, even the most entrenched tyrants can be defeated. The legal precedent our case established has been cited in dozens of similar disputes nationwide. Courts have used our documentation of systematic harassment and procedural violations as a template for identifying HOA abuse patterns in other communities. The Sunset Lakes Standard has become shorthand among property rights attorneys for the kind of evidence needed to prove systematic civil rights violations by homeowner associations. But perhaps the most satisfying validation came last month, when a young family with 2 small children moved into Margaret's former house. The Patels had researched our community extensively before purchasing, specifically seeking a neighborhood where community governance prioritized cooperation over control. "We heard about what happened here," explained Dr. Priya Patel as we welcomed them to the neighborhood. "We wanted to live somewhere that had already learned the difference between community standards and community tyranny. Their children immediately joined the pack of kids who treat the lake as their collective playground. And within a week, the Patels were volunteering for community garden maintenance and participating in the evening dock conversations that have become our informal town halls. This is Margaret's true legacy, not the fear and isolation she tried to create, but the stronger, more democratic community that rose from the ashes of her surveillance state. She thought she was building an empire of absolute control over her neighbors' lives. Instead, she created a generation of citizens who understand their rights and won't surrender them to anyone who confuses authority with wisdom. The dock stretches into the sunset-painted water, sturdy and peaceful, exactly as I envisioned when I first drew plans for a simple wooden platform where my family could enjoy the lake we'd worked so hard to afford. It serves that purpose beautifully. Emma has caught dozens of bass from its weathered boards. Sarah and I have shared countless morning coffees watching the mist rise from the water, and neighbors gather here regularly for impromptu conversations that strengthen our community bonds. But it has become something more. a monument to the principle that in America, your neighbors can't steal your dreams just because they think they know better than you do. It stands as proof that justice isn't always swift, but it's ultimately unstoppable when communities refuse to let fear silence their voices. Margaret Thornfield thought she could use this dock as a weapon to demonstrate her absolute power over our community. She had no idea she was building the foundation of her own destruction. Sometimes the very tool a tyrant chooses becomes the monument to their downfall and the symbol of their victim's ultimate victory. The lake reflects the last light of evening, carrying the sounds of children playing and families gathering, the sounds of a community that learned to fight for itself and won. The dock will outlast all of us, weathering storms and seasons, bearing witness to the simple truth that when good people stand together, no bully can hold them down. That's a legacy worth fighting for. That's a legacy worth preserving. And that's why, when the next Margaret Thornfield emerges in some other community, there will be people ready to remind them that in America, we don't surrender our rights to anyone who mistakes a clipboard for a crown. The water laps gently against the dock's supports, and in that rhythm, I hear the heartbeat of democracy itself, steady, persistent, and ultimately unstoppable when people remember that freedom isn't free, but it's always worth defending. This is the story of how a $100,000 fine for a simple dock became a $1 million lesson in community justice. It's the story of how ordinary neighbors became extraordinary citizens when they remembered that democracy isn't a spectator sport. It's the story of Lake Harmony, where the water runs clear and the community runs free. And it's proof that sometimes, when you're fighting for what's right, the weapon your enemy chooses becomes the instrument of their own defeat. The dock remains, weathered but strong, a testament to the simple truth that Americans don't bow to petty tyrants, especially when those tyrants are foolish enough to underestimate the power of communities that refuse to surrender their dreams.